Okay, so we're on lesson 25. If everything goes well, we'll finish 48, which means there'll be 2 chapters left. So we have 1 or 2 lessons left, probably 2. But, but yeah, think about what we might want to study next, or I'll pick something really bizarre and arcane. Like, what? I don't even know what arcane is, Pastor. That sounds weird. I don't want to go there. Okay, so let's turn to chapter 46. Now, the last few weeks, who's been the main human character in the events taking place in Genesis? Joseph. But of course, somebody who was kind of the main figure of human events before was his dad. Well, now this is going to be Joseph and Jacob. So at last they're going to meet. So this should be interesting because they've been separated for quite some time, haven't they? A lot has happened, right? What's one thing though that Jacob now knows that he thought wasn't the case? He knows somebody is alive. He knows Joseph lives, whereas he thought that he had died ages ago, and his sons, they kind of orchestrated this devious thing to get rid of him and sell him into slavery. And I think that they just kind of told themselves so much that, he must have just died somewhere along the way, that I think they believed that he also died. And that kind of also led to it making it really hard for them to recognize Joseph when he's right in front of them. Of course, he's older and he's wearing Egyptian clothing, and so all of that is totally unexpected. Okay, so let's turn to chapter 46 and we'll begin. Okay. So now the backdrop in this setting is that Jacob is going to travel to Egypt, but he's a bit hesitant because, Isaac, right? His dad pretty much stayed in Canaan, and that's the promised land that God said, this will be your land. So he's like, okay, I'm still a bit hesitant, right? And so that's kind of where we find ourselves. So let's read the first 7 verses of 46, and we'll kind of go from there. So Israel, now who's Israel? Jacob, yeah. You notice Genesis is calling Jacob Israel a lot now. And we'll find the text will even kind of do a subtle switch where Israel will refer to the nation, not just the man. And this is really the first time that happens. It'll happen in these chapters. So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. Notice the 2 Jacobs. And he said, here am I. Okay. Then he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. Now, isn't that what was promised to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob previously, and it's being repeated here. So even though he won't be living in the promised land, God's promise still stands. Okay, he will make them into a great nation. So nation not only means the territory, but, right, the people. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. What does that mean? Yeah. In other words, you're going to die in Egypt, but you'll be reconciled back with Joseph. Okay, so this is quite comforting. He's an old man. He knows he doesn't have many years left. Okay. Then Jacob set out from Beersheba the sons of Israel carried Jacob their father, their little ones and their wives in the wagons that Pharaoh had sent to carry him. What? What just unfolded here? Yeah. So we know Joseph is a very powerful man, and this has Pharaoh's full blessing, where Pharaoh sent all the stuff to, it's like, it's like when a congregation calls a pastor, they usually pay for the movers. Instead of, well, we recall you, but you're on your own. That normally doesn't happen, right? Well, it's that same sort of thing here. He basically called Beacon's Moving Company or whatever, and if they're still around, and they're moving, Jacob and family, whatnot, to Egypt. Okay. They also took their livestock and their goods, which they had gained in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt, Jacob and all his offspring with him. So this is kind of the entire clan. What would be considered the entire nation of Israel, or what will become it. Okay. His sons and his sons' sons with him, his daughters and his sons' daughters. So you can kind of see how far this extends. It's not like third cousin twice removed or whatever that means. But, sons, grandsons, grandkids, so on and so forth. Okay? All his offspring he brought with him into Egypt. So he did have some concerns at first, right? But at Beersheba, so God came to him as he had done in the past and comforted him to let him know everything's going to be fine. The promise that I gave to Abraham, the promise that I gave to Isaac, the promise that I gave to you 53 years earlier is still true. Okay? So that's quite comforting. And he knows that he will die in Egypt, but what God promised will still happen. Okay. On the middle of page 1, so I'll kind of bring this out because we will see the use of 3 I's. I am God. I will. I myself will. So we have I. This is so if we're reading and we're not halfway asleep, it becomes pretty obvious that what? That God is working through events to make these things happen. Sure, people are involved, people are doing stuff, but God is behind the scenes making sure this happens. So this is all matching God's long-term will and promise. The Messiah will come, and this is part of that. Okay? In Egypt, far from Canaan, Jacob's descendants found fertile ground. We'll get into this in a moment, but they blossomed where no one expected, filling the land with their numbers. It was not by chance or coincidence, but by divine design. I. God speaking. The Lord kept his word and will mold them into a mighty nation. Hardship did not subdue them. Emptied of their self-reliance, they became clay in the Lord's hands, ready to be shaped. So, yeah, there's going to be stuff where, God will use other events and make them prosperous. Their strength grew not despite adversity, but because of how God used adversity. Such a testament to the Lord, his promise to make them a great nation. Okay. Well, let's continue on. Right now we're going to read a genealogy. Now, there were other genealogies, and it does serve a purpose, even though when we kind of look at it, we're like, oh boy, a bunch of names, half the people I don't recognize, and right? So, we're not going to fixate on this, but it does serve a purpose. So that's verses 8 through 27. That's a whole bunch of verses, isn't it? So, maybe we won't read the entire lot, but it's there, but we can kind of give an idea. Now, these are the names of the descendants of Israel who came to Egypt. So it starts with Jacob, right? So Jacob, in this genealogy, Jacob's the patriarch. So it's starting with him, and then, okay, who are his descendants? Okay. And so later on, we'll come across some of these names. So we'll be like, oh yeah, he's right? In some way, related to Jacob. Okay, Jacob and his sons, Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, and his sons of Reuben, Hanok, Palu, Hezron, Carmi. Now, when you see the grandsons of Jacob, they're not that familiar, are they? But when you read the sons of Jacob, those names are familiar. The sons of Simeon. Oh yeah, Simeon is a common name. Okay, and then so on and so forth, right? The sons of Levi. Why does that matter? Yeah, the Levitical priesthood. So later on, his descendants will not be allowed to own land, right? And because they are to serve as priests. So they won't be able to farm, they won't be able to tend sheep or any of that. But the people's tithes will pay their wages so they can live, and they will serve as God's priests. So the sons of Judah. Oh, yeah, isn't that a big deal? Because what happens in the future? Well, the north and the south will have a civil war, right? Except in Israel, I guess the civil war sticks, and it's the north who eventually goes away first, right? And Judah and half the tribe of Benjamin, or, it's not completely Judah, but mostly Judah, is the southern kingdom. Okay, so yeah, we're going like, I can kind of see these names. The sons of Zebulun, so on and so forth. The sons of Gad, the sons of, who's mentioned here? Rachel, Jacob's wife, Joseph and Benjamin, right? So Benjamin becomes like a really puny little tribe, right? But that's important, right? Because Jesus is affiliated with that one. Right? And so the sons of Dan, and of course that's really more the northern part of Israel later. And then verse 26, all the persons belonging to Jacob who came to Egypt, who were his own descendants, not including Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were 2. All the persons of the house of Jacob who came to Egypt were 70. So 70 is kind of a good, we see that number a lot in Scripture. What we'll find, though, if we kind of dig into this a little bit, is that the Old Testament translation called the Septuagint has 75. And the book of Acts also mentions 75. So what do we do with this? Well, I could tell you my thinking on this. So the Septuagint is a translation. So generally speaking, you would prefer what was translated, not the translation. Okay? Here's where it gets really weird, because what the Septuagint used to translate from doesn't exist anymore. Those manuscripts are gone. Okay? And so the manuscripts that we have, surviving manuscripts that we have for the Septuagint, are about 1,000 years older than the surviving manuscripts for the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew text. And you go, well, why is that the case? Well, the reason why it's called the Masoretic text is because a group of Jewish scholars called the Masoretes, right? They said, well, we have what they did is they took all the text they had and they tried to clean it up. They said, well, let's look and see which we think makes the best sense. So they did that, and they put together, it's kind of like what the King James, translators did. That was such a monumental translation that they, for the most part, Revelation was quite a gaggle, but most of the other books, they did a really good job of taking whatever was available to them and saying, okay, this is what we'll use. And then what they did is Hebrew doesn't have any vowels. So what they did is they put little markers below the consonants, the letters, to say, well, this is how the word should sound. So it's like when you read a license plate and you only see consonants but no vowel, and you go, oh, well, the person, and usually you can figure out what the person means in those 5 letters or whatever it is. So the Masoretes also did interpretations. And in some cases, I would say most of the time they were right. I would say in some cases I think they botched it and go, no, they should have vowel pointed it this way for this meaning. But in this case, I'm going to side with the Septuagint. I'm going to say, well, the Septuagint had access to texts that the Masoretes later did not have access to, or they just thought, oh, well, we think the 70 is more authoritative. And they may have done that because of the number. 70 is a really good biblical number, okay? So, but because in the New Testament 75 is also mentioned, I'm thinking that's the actual number, okay? So that's where I kind of side on this, but you can't get crazy based on the text, because you go, well, the Masoretic text is right, and was Stephen, when he was doing this, was he simply saying this based on the text that he had? Well, that could have been the case too. But so that's kind of the thing. So if you just kind of get all geeky on that, I just wanted to share with you that mismatch and what I think best makes sense. Okay? All right. Because that's part of my job, right? Is to kind of bring these weird things up and say, hey, yeah, how do we make sense of this stuff? Okay. So we now have an idea. So this was really the outlay of these are the patriarchs and matriarch of what will become the nation of Israel. Okay? And of course that makes perfect sense because Jacob was renamed Israel. Are we ready to continue? Okay. 28 through 30. He had sent Judah ahead of him, okay, to Joseph to show the way before him to Goshen. And so the he in this case is God, right? God working through humans and et cetera, sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to show the way before him in Goshen. So Goshen is where they're going to settle. Now you think, well, the way that it's described and what we know of it, we think, well, you'd think the whole place would be full of Egyptians, but it's not. Kind of odd how that happens, okay? In Goshen, and they came into the land of Goshen. So land of Goshen is a regional area of Egypt, and it's not a separate country. Okay, so when we hear that term land of Goshen, don't think, oh, okay, another country. It's not. Okay. Then Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to meet Israel, his father, in Goshen. He presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. So this is a very emotional what? Yeah, reunion. Well, why not? I mean, my goodness. His dad thought he was dead. And he's alive. And Joseph was a teenager when he was sold into slavery. So, wow. Israel said to Joseph, now let me die, since I have seen your face and know that you are still alive. Is this a death wish? No, it's not, right? But now he's saying, if I die, it's okay, because, right? And we kind of talk that way once in a while. It's just saying, oh, well, here's something finally has happened that's so momentous, right? So.
But wasn't Joseph one of his, I hate to say favorite children?
Yeah.
Special. Who was a special child to him?
I don't know if he was special, but yeah. Yeah, Rachel is his second wife, yeah. Yeah. Israel's families are full of dysfunction, I'll tell you. But, it's, we get to see how messed up, in many cases, they are. And so I'm kind of glad Scripture doesn't really shy away from that stuff too much. Because we get to see, well, it lets us know that, because, I would say after meeting with lots of people, as a pastor, I would say most families are messed up somewhere, right? Because sometimes I would be, what? I'll mention this lady's name because she has passed away. I'm not going to mention the stuff that she said, but Carlene Allard, I remember visiting with her. But I said, but Carlene, you're so squared away. I was just kind of shocked with some of the, right? And yet, So we all have often experiences that we should not have had, and yet we somehow learn to deal with them and we overcome. And in many ways, we're better, right? Because we've incorporated this, but then we've turned the corner. So, and so in that sense, we could even see how in our personal lives, even through something that was wrong, that we know is wrong and that we say should have never happened and may even still leave scars, we can look at that and go, yeah, but I see how that caused this to happen in my life, and this may be a good thing. Okay? So that is also what I've learned being a pastor. So it's, in that regard, it's kind of cool, even though in many ways these things are heartbreaking. Okay. So, what do we know? It just mentioned in passing, it mentioned that Joseph, well, basically he hitched his chariot, right? Who's the powerful man here? Joseph. Now, of course, Jacob's his dad, but he's the second most powerful man in Egypt. So, because of that, unless you're Pharaoh, everybody else is supposed to come to him. It's part of he's powerful, he's busy running a country, or at least trying to manage the country through a famine, and we're going to find out that still, even though Egypt has lots of grain, it's still it'll lead to great poverty for most of the nation. So, yeah, so he's doing all that, and so people are to see him, and that would be the same for his dad. But he said, no, he's my dad, and so all the conventions that come with his position, he basically, and that the text mentions a chariot. A chariot means that he's a pretty powerful guy. Okay, if you're a regular local yokel, you don't have a chariot. You see some powerful dude with a chariot, and that's the only time you'd see one. Okay, unless you watch the movie Ben-Hur, and the little spiked wheels on the side. That was so cool when I was a kid. Oh, anyways, I thought it was. All right, are we ready to continue on? Okay. Oh, there is a new version of Ben-Hur, which is pretty good too. Came out a few years ago. I think I still like the Charlton Heston one, but it's well done. So if you want to see it, you can probably find it somewhere. Pay $3 to Amazon, or maybe it'll be on Netflix, I don't know. Okay, verses 31 to 34. Here we go. Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh and will say to him, notice how he's talking, I'll go up to Pharaoh and say to him, or tell him, like, really? You're going to tell Pharaoh something? So this tells you that Pharaoh and Joseph are on good terms. And yeah, Pharaoh's the main guy, but they could, this lets us know that they could speak like regular people to each other. Now in public, I'm sure Joseph would show all the proper deference and honor owed to Pharaoh. I mean, that's part of how that works. But this is just kind of interesting to kind of hear this, right? I will go up and tell Pharaoh and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household who are in the land of Canaan have come to me. And the men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock, and they have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have. When Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? You shall say, so what's he doing? He's saying, tell Pharaoh this. So Joseph is he's saying, okay. I mean, they're already in the land of Goshen, but he has some other things going on. Say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our fathers. So in other words, this is our way of life. It's not something that we could just quit that easily. Because what we'll find out is that this is not so much the case for the Egyptians. They'll have livestock, but it's more settled. So they would be more, I guess, more ranchers. I'm trying to think if you have, so So if you were to think of Egypt, you wouldn't think of these long cattle drives, right? Where you have the longhorns and you're going 1,000 miles or something in our history. The cattle would be in a particular area, and that's kind of where they stay. Whereas the Israelites would kind of be the cowhands doing the cattle drive. If you want to kind of use those as analogies to kind of help you understand the difference. Okay? So until now, both we and our fathers, in order that you may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. So whatever happened culturally, they kind of moved away from that. Though the shepherding model continued in Israelite culture, even up to the day of Jesus, and still in some areas, you have shepherding kind of taking place. Was it in the U.S. there was a number of shepherds who came from, I think it was the Pyrenees Mountains or something, and they settled in Montana and Wyoming and whatnot, and for a number of years that kind of subculture existed in our nation. So shepherding is, even though it doesn't make a whole lot of sense with kind of the industrialization of agriculture and our food and produce and whatnot, it hasn't all gone away. Okay, so you have these two different forms of how you raise your animals, how you use them. And so this will kind of lead to a separation because the Egyptians looked down on shepherding. Oh, we did that a long time ago, but we've moved past that, right? So this, not only are the Israelites getting a really good choice of real estate, as in, it's part of the Nile Delta and it floods, but because it's part of the Nile Delta, it means you have water, and it means the soil is rich. So they're living in if you can put up with the flooding, it's really good land. Okay? And I suppose if you're more settled, maybe you don't want to put up with the flooding, so you're going, we'll live close to the river, but not so much where we're going to get flooded as much. So you can kind of see that geographic separation, and it's also shaped by their lifestyle. So this is going to allow the Israelites not to remain completely intact and isolated, but they'll be able to maintain a lot more of their kind of ways because they won't have as much interaction as if they're living right in the middle of full Egyptian culture. Egyptian culture will exist and it will influence them, but it will be more indirect. And it'll take several generations before they start becoming Egyptian. Okay? All right. There you have it. More than you wanted to know. So, so what would be called the land of Goshen today is kind of the populated area of Egypt. But then the area has become more desert-like over the centuries. So back then there was less desert. Okay? So I think is it the Sahara Desert? Is that the one? Yeah, I think so. And that's the one that's huge now. But we could, if you can take we've done radar scans and other things, and we can actually see where there were riverbeds and rivers long ago that aren't there anymore. So, and it wasn't that long ago. Okay. All right. Are we ready? Chapter 47. So what's going on in the land of Goshen? Let's look at the first 6 verses. So Joseph went in and told Pharaoh, "My father and my brothers with their flocks and herds and all that they possess have come to the land of Canaan. They are now in the land of Goshen." Of course, Pharaoh kind of said, "Hey, So he was giving them at least fertile lands, right? Yeah. And from among his brothers, he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to his brothers, What is your occupation?" And they said to Pharaoh, "Your servants are shepherds as our fathers were." They said to Pharaoh, "We have to come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan." And now, please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brother have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen. And if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock. Okay, so, wow. He's saying, he's offering them basically, I'll hire them as part of, to kind of work for me. And so they'll get good wages, et cetera, right? So, so in many ways, he's saying, because what's going on right now? There's a famine going on. But Pharaoh will be kind of the last person affected, won't he? Because, through Joseph's management and everything, but yeah, he's ruling a nation, and so he's going to have enough to eat. And so he'll have livestock even if other people are in the famine, right? Well, there's grain, but you still need water. And if there's not a whole lot of water, even if you have grain, what's going to happen to the livestock? We're going to have a fire sale. Well, I guess you don't have a fire sale but you know what I mean, right? So, it happens even in our own nation, right? When something's going on, okay, so a bunch of ranchers sell their cattle at a low price, but they go, well, it's better than having them die because of, with the situation. And so for 6 months or 8 months, the price of beef is low, but then for the next 2 years, it's high, right? Because, the stocks were depleted. And so now it takes a little while to, to kind of build the herds back up. Okay. So this is all pretty good, isn't it? Yeah. And so they basically, now what Joseph said to his brothers, tell the Pharaoh this, he didn't tell him to lie, but he told him to say it in such a way that what? That they may remain in that area because, well, Pharaoh knows the Egyptians don't really like this sort of nomadic type of shepherding. So it'll be good if they kind of stay there. Okay? Let's continue on. Let's look at verses 7 through 12. Okay. Then Joseph brought in Jacob his father and stood him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Okay, isn't that a little odd? Who is Jacob in earthly terms to Pharaoh? Nothing. He matters because Joseph matters. And so in that regard, it's very important. But if he's blessing Pharaoh, in a sense, we could say from God's perspective, if we're looking at that, well, yeah, right? Because it's through Jacob's descendant, right, that the Messiah will come. And so, yeah, theologically it makes sense that it should be Jacob blessing Pharaoh, even though from an earthly perspective, really? Okay, so let's continue on. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, how many are the days of the years of your life? And Jacob said to Pharaoh, the days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. Now we could go, well, that kind of sounds weird. And yet at that time, historically, okay, because this has been written down, the Egyptians considered the ideal lifespan to be 120 years. So it wasn't as if only, the ancient Israelites lived a long time. Now, that's not to say everybody lived a long time, but that we can find historical documentation of something like that being written has to tell us that there were people who did live a long time. So, it's like, well, what happened? Because if you go back to like 1900 or something, and you go, well, at what age did the average man die in 1900? It was something like 49 years old. 49? Well, right? Because now there's lots of health issues, You can have this one health issue that will knock you dead that we can often manage, like a heart attack or some other things, as well as, in many ways, the professions were a lot more dangerous. They're still dangerous now, but we've instituted a lot of safe procedures and whatnot. So now our lifespan in 100 years has gone up to, in the upper 70s. Or I think women are like 82 or something like that, even though our lifespans are starting to go down a little bit. Too many Cheetos. That's what it is. Okay, let's continue on. Okay. The days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life. So this is the word ra for evil, but it doesn't have to mean evil, and I don't think that's what Jacob is really saying. I think he's really saying my life has been hard, not evil. The context makes me think that the word ra has a different meaning. Okay, I'm just sharing with you that I don't think the translators did a good job here. That's how I would have translated as difficult. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, is that the NIV? So the NIV, yeah. ESV. Okay. So, yeah. I would have done difficult or hard or harsh or tough, something along those lines. So I don't think Jacob is really talking about evil, but just the whole situation. You can go, well, yeah, with Joseph or whatever, but he's just saying he's had a hard life and it's been rough. Okay? And I think some of that is because of what his sons had done. But at the same time, he's like, but it's great now. So few and difficult have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. Then Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Okay. And Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with food according to the number of their dependents. So, because of Joseph's position, they will not be left wanting. Okay, and there's drought, but they're living in the best place to be. So now, let's say if you had a drought condition for 20 years or something, you'd have a mass migration in the land of Egypt to other places. But this is not long enough where you have all the places where the people have settled. It's not long enough to cause this huge migration. Okay, so it's not as if the Egyptians are going to flood the land of Goshen and overtake it, at least at this point. Okay? All right. So that's kind of what's going on. And this kind of gives us a sense of what's happening, and God is working through these things to ensure that his promise continues. Okay? Let's press on, shall we? 13 through 22 then. Now, there was no food in all the land. Well, there was food, right? But how is it working? Well, you have to go and buy the grain. Right? I mean, we see that. So even the people of Egypt have to buy the grain. Well, you'd think, okay, do they get a cut rate or a cut deal? Or what's happening? And I'm thinking we don't really know what's going on, but I'm thinking that Pharaoh is providing for his people, but he's also using this to increase his power. That's not weird in government, is it? Where government institutes policies in a sense to control your life or have whatever it may be, right? So, because let's continue on, and you'll go, wow, okay. So, and Joseph will be involved in this. But we'll see also how the people respond. Okay? So, there was famine, okay? In all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land, hold it, I have to turn the page. Okay, of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by the reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they had bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. So Pharaoh is benefiting. We can see this right here, right? And when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone." And Joseph answered, "Give your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock if your money is gone." Well, if you're starving, and then your livestock are not doing too well because of the famine, okay, I may not like it, but it's better than being dead. Okay? So, under the circumstances, you can go, okay, well, this seems an equitable trade, or why not? Would it be that bad just to say, well, let's open up the food stores and just give it to the people of Egypt for free? Or there has to be some way to manage it so it's all not squandered. But this is what's happening. Okay, and we don't know what's taking place between Pharaoh and Joseph. Okay, Joseph is doing all this and running it, but at the same time, it has to meet Pharaoh's goals. Okay, because Pharaoh is still the Pharaoh. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. He supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. What about the next year? Because are we now, this is the third or fourth year of the famine, So earlier we know that 2 years had happened. Now his father had moved here, so they're 3 years or maybe 4, I don't know. Okay. And when that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, "We will not hide from the Lord that our money is all spent. The herds and livestock are my Lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my Lord but our bodies and our land." Okay, now what? We don't want to starve to death, but we have nothing to offer but our bodies and our land. That kind of sounds scary, doesn't it? Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we with our land will be servants to Pharaoh. And give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate. Well, seed, yeah, but we're still going to have to wait for rain. But what does this tell you? The people are desperate, but they know how everything works, and they're saying, well, we want to live long enough so that we can plant, right? And reap a crop. So they're not seeing this as the end, but they're seeing this in a sense where they're kind of leveraging what they have for the future. Okay. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, and all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made servants of them. Slaves. I mean, it's really the word. It doesn't mean that they were treated super badly, but yeah. In a sense, you would say, well, Pharaoh owns them. What? Okay. From one end of Egypt to the other. So in other words, it's bad enough that this was commonplace. Okay, so the word all doesn't mean every single individual person, but it's common enough where basically this is the general rule of thumb. Okay, kind of recognize how language is being used here. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. Okay, so as Americans, when we hear this, we would go, this is horrible. How could this happen? And yes, it's horrible. But what we'll find out is that the people actually want this. You go, what? Well, they realize what's going on and they say, well, what do we need to do to survive? Okay? And so, in that sense, they may not be happy with it, but they want this because they see this. Oh, what options do we have? Well, this is the best option from what's available to them. And so they go, we'll live. But they're planning on things in the future at some point to be different because they want seed. So that in itself kind of tells us how the people in general are thinking. Okay? So let's continue on through the next 3 verses because it'll unfold a little bit more on the people's thinking. So in verses 23 through 26, we hear, then Joseph said to the people, behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own as seed for the field and food for yourselves and your households, and as food for your little ones. So now, because they're, quote, slaves, what percentage does Pharaoh get? 20%. Yeah. So now, if you're well-to-do in America, right? Because if you look at, well, who pays taxes in America, right? I mean, it's like the 1% gets attacked on the news a lot, but it's like, it's the 1% who's actually paying for almost everything the government does. So we should not be complaining about 1%, but say, well, thank you, because if you're not making a whole lot of money, it's not you who's actually funding the government. You get most of it back. So, so if somebody's getting away with not paying taxes, well, we need to change the laws, right? I mean, that just makes sense. Well, if there's a legal loophole, and if I don't have to pay a tax, most people are going to use the loophole, right? Hello? So don't be mad at the person for doing what's prudent, but be mad at, we have some really weird tax laws that give too many people breaks and stuff. But so here, 20%. So if you're part of the wealthy in America and you're not using loopholes, you're paying way more than that. Now, it's not as bad as it used to be. Like if you go back in history, like during the Eisenhower era or whatever, you guys were kids, but I wasn't born. But I mean, the tax rates were pretty high. You go, wow, it was like 60, whatever it was. It was it was a lot. And you go, wow, how do we even put up with that and not have this giant rebellion? So 20%, so okay, they keep 80. But what does this do if you're Pharaoh? Well, it kind of secures a certain amount of stuff. You're going to be stable, but it's not so oppressive that the people are going to rebel and want to destroy you. Yet you're going to have a good, steady income and everything that you need. So it's actually setting up a government that is more stable and more secure. Okay? And at least for a couple generations, everything should be fine because people will still remember, oh yeah, we were really bad off. Now once, by the 3rd generation, people forget all that stuff. So that's usually in the 3rd generation, people will start getting mad. 20%? It should be 10%. So, but so this is long term. It's going to bode well for Pharaoh, his family, and the running of Egypt. Okay, so let's finish up through 26. Okay, and they said, "You have saved our lives. May it please my Lord, we will be servants to Pharaoh, slaves." Okay? So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day. When Genesis was written, that Pharaoh should have the 5th, the land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. So I kind of wrote, because it says, the ESV kind of is a little genteel on the translation. Not bad, it gets the main point. But I would say, let us find favor in your sight and become slaves to Pharaoh. The people are actually asking for this. Okay? It's better than the alternative. So at this point, and they're not blaming Pharaoh for the weather, right? So it's his fault. No, it's just saying, this is happening and this is one way that we could do okay. And they know that what Joseph has done. So in this regard, they're saying slaves to Pharaoh, but they're telling this to Joseph. So you could kind of see this kind of dichotomy or split tunneling, using Kevin's terms. I don't even know what that is. But where the people are very grateful to Joseph. They're not saying slaves to you. They're thankful to him because they have this option. So they're probably thinking, well, if he didn't do all this stuff, we would probably already be dead. Because they had enough life experiences to kind of know that, in the words of Thomas Hobbes, I think, that life can be short, brutish, and cruel. And so, knowing that, they're grateful and thankful to Joseph, and actually glad that there is an option that can work. They wouldn't want it if times were prosperous, but it's not. So I just wanted to let you know that the people are actually seeking this, even though how could anybody seek, right? So this isn't American-style slavery. You're still going to farm your land. Well, technically it's Pharaoh's, but as long as you give 20%, everything's cool. Okay? So yeah. And if you're well-to-do in America, you're paying more than that anyways. So, okay, are we ready to continue? So, if you were British a long time ago, it was horrible. They'd take like 98% of your money. It's like, why should I even go to work? Before Maggie Thatcher came along and said, that's ridiculous. So, 27 to 31, because we don't want to hear history and politics. We want to hear scripture. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. And when the time drew near that Israel must die, Jacob, he called his son Joseph and said to him, if now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. So this is an oath. Okay, and this particular ritual is very serious. So, don't do this if you're not going to follow this oath. Okay? Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place. So, we will find that the bones of Jacob were carried out of Egypt. Like, what? Okay. He answered, I will do as you have said. And he said, swear to me. And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. So basically what? That's the way of saying that after that he died. May have not been immediate, but he died probably within a day or however long. And but Jacob says, don't bury me here. Why would that even matter? Right? I mean, when you say, okay, well, he knows the promise of God. He doesn't know everything, but he knows the promise of God. He has faith that God will be true and carry it out. So whether he's buried in Egypt or not, it's not going to change that. So what would be being buried where his fathers are buried? What is that kind of... It could be, sentiment, right? But it could also be in a sense that in a sense, his actions are testifying to his trust in what God has said. And he wants to be there, not here. He wants to be in the land God promised, to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Israel, and so on. Yes. Wow. No. I think it's like probably 1100, 1200 BC thereabouts. I'm just sticking my finger up in the wind. I mean, it's not. No, it's. I could be wrong by 100 years or so, but I'm just. Yeah, it's around that time. Well, yeah, they don't know. Yeah. They don't know the entire story. So God continues to reveal over time. But this goes back to Adam. And over time, God tells a little bit more and a little bit more. But so they have this promise, and they're trusting God in the promise of what he will do, right? And so they may not, oh, well, yeah, there's going to be a Messiah, and he's going to be the cure for our sin problem, and his name will be Jesus. They don't know all that. But they know that God has a solution, and they believe and trust in him for that. Okay? And that faith is saving faith. Okay? Now, we know a lot more because we've seen the revelation, right, of God unfolding these things in history, and then we see its fulfillment. So, we know a lot more. And so we would say, oh, yeah. So we would say, we can fill in a lot of the blanks. And so we will say, well, yeah, you just don't trust in a vague Messiah. You trust in Jesus Christ because he ends up being the non-vague Messiah of the promise at one time, which was not fully made known. Okay? All right, let's the back of page 4, this little blurb. A monumental transition takes place in Israel's history. The reign of the last patriarch fades, Jacob/Israel, bringing an epoch to a close. A prolonged time away from their promised land awaits. It'll be about 400 years, won't it? Yeah. Egypt, once a place of refuge, will turn into an oppressive taskmaster. That's going to take place right? Of course, it'll also be Exodus, but, we're going to get the hints of that in Genesis. During this time, God's voice will fall silent with no divine appearances or prophets. This has happened elsewhere in history as well. So you go, well, God spoke to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We haven't heard squat from him for hundreds of years. Is he still alive? Is he still around? See? So God works in his ways, choosing in time. And if we're astute readers of Scripture, we'll see this. So you go, well, God hasn't spoken to me like he came to Abraham. So, you're not the first person in history not to have these. And in fact, even when Abraham was alive, most people didn't get these special revelations from God. Really. Okay? It would be like, you're on your deathbed. Well, Jesus raised the widow of Nain and he raised Lazarus. He may not raise you. He will on the last day. See? So, we need to kind of understand this in perspective. And you go, oh, well, you're not Abraham. You're not Lazarus. You're whoever you are. And God works in his ways and his times in your life as he chooses. And faith says, cool. Unbelief says, wait a minute. Right? So this is just to kind of give us a kind of a perspective. Okay? So during this time, God's voice will fall silent with no divine appearances or prophets, only the echo of a promise made to Abraham. Your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. Genesis 15. Wow. That's not like Exodus chapter 20. Right? Okay. These concluding chapters of Genesis become a fitting preface for the book of Exodus. But we have 2 more. Okay. So, let's close with prayer, shall we? Heavenly Father, indeed, it seems as if your people are always on some type of journey, as are we, even if it may not always involve sojourning or taking a voyage from one place to another. But things are always going on in our lives. You're always at work in our lives, even if we may not see your hand working through events and other people. But give us faith to understand that this is true. And also faith to understand that you work through us. And that in many ways we are your hands in this world. to help carry out your will. Give us such faith, and also give us skills and abilities and a desire to do this as best as we can with what we know. In our Savior's name we pray. Amen.